what we want, that magical unicorn doesn't exist, right? Like that would make this a lot easier.
Lead is a remote-first company based out of Canada.
What makes a world-class Microsoft 365 intranet and digital workplace?
All right, so let's do question 2. What is holding the future back for employee experience and managers today? So I thought I would just highlight, one of the challenges for holding back things is poor road mapping and planning at a strategic level, right? So as we start to look at like investments in intranets, we look at investments in collaboration and a variety of other things. A lot of times we're not using the latest technologies. We don't know when we're going to use and have access to some of these things that empower, new management, learning, and other scenarios like that. And so, so certainly, tackling that can be a boon and a way to potentially improve this. But when you yourself look at what holds people back, is there things that come to mind for yourself that you've seen, Asif, that really stops people from having a better employee management experience today?
Yeah, a lot of these kind of things I talk about. I tell people that I went from being a technologist to a psychologist, I feel, because it's very much about how the human mind works. I feel, and it's been reported also by some institutions and some studies, that the goals of employees are not necessarily aligned with the goals of managers. And what that alignment is not there, then you're not listening to the other person of what they really need to be successful. Now, once again, I used to be a very, very super technical kind of guy where like, what are you talking about? I'm just going to make this happen, use the data view web part, blah, blah, blah. And then that's what they need. But is it really what they need? Or do they need a very simple answer to what they're looking for just to get their job done? So listening, critical to employee success, obviously, right? But that's something that we have to keep on reminding ourselves, especially in today's age where we're doing this thing, virtually. That's super important.
Yeah, I find one of the other challenges is that readiness. So if you look at like process and people, right? So technology is one part of it, and digital employee experience, there's no shortage of tools, right, and techniques to improve the employee experience. The challenge sometimes becomes, and I would argue, we often think of people, but I personally don't think it's people. And maybe this would be an interesting one where there might be a debate, but I think process is the problem, right? So what ends up happening is if you understand, the employee experience, the management, whatever it is we're talking about, process today, and then you layer, the technology and how this is going to impact people, and how do we get the right people in leadership roles and other things to drive this. The people and the technology kind of works itself out. But if you don't have that process, understanding that richness, it becomes really problematic. So, while I talked about road mapping, and some visuals there, like how technology road mapping is really important. Sometimes the gap is more understanding the processes. So, in the analogy that I had here, one of the examples that we often run into is employee onboarding. And so you think of the employee experience, from pre-boarding, before you're even an employee, before you have an identity, an email address in the company, there should still be an experience there, right? An employee experience. And that should be a rich one, and it should be digitally enabled, and so on and so forth. And then what happens is, what's that pre-boarding experience like? So if you have a pre-boarding SharePoint site, that could have a really great experience, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Or what if you had like something else where, you have, you're an onboarded employee, but, how do we care and how do we support you in that onboarding? Not just, connecting with your work and the things you need to know to be successful, but connecting with peers and people outside your working groups, communities and other things in the organization. So there's a lot of areas where, again, I think, we start with a roadmap of like intranets or something that's, I think every organization has some sort of launch point, but then you think of like, okay, what's next from that, right? What about this departmental scenario? What about that departmental scenario? And what about the employee experiences around those things? So I definitely, I think that process gap is certainly a problem. And sometimes, domain expertise from someone who knows about that area can tell you kind of what they think you should do there, which can shine some light onto it. Sometimes you just have to spend the energy, right? Get people in a room and start talking about it, and all of a sudden these things come up as well, right?
I'll throw a couple of things in there as well, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So a couple of things, and I read a lot, so I remember some other things hearing you talk, Richard. One of the articles, I'm trying to remember exactly which one, but they made a really good point. I believe it's on Fortune, that better leadership and better growth opportunities, those things tied as number one things on especially tech workers' minds and others as well as to they needed that. And if they're not getting that, almost a quarter of the people were saying, you know what, this is the reason that I'll be leaving my company. And as you mentioned, that onboarding, pre-boarding, and the whole experience, even before you have an identity in the company, is very important. But what it's been the case before until now, hopefully it's going to change, is that IT and HR don't talk to each other as much. You got IT goals and you got the HR goals, and those teams have to work together, no matter how small or how big the teams are, because you're looking at not just the technology stack that they'll be interacting with. Asif needs a computer, their phone, and all that stuff the first day, but you're also looking at the well-being and understanding of who it is and what they need to be successful day one, or maybe even pre-day one, and putting it together as a complete package of what your persona, your employee is going to be getting when they come, even before they come. So that symbiotic relationship between HR and IT, I think it's already happening more intentionally these days. But you will see, I think, a lot more of that in the future as well.
Yeah, I've seen one of my favorite examples of this is a large 150,000 person organization we work with, and this is years ago, actually, a couple of years ago, they realized that, so customer experience is sort of the opposite, right? We have employee experience and customer experience, and there's lots of comments on like that they're connected, and you can't have a good customer experience without a good employee experience, and I agree with those concepts. But customer experience is arguably more mature, right? Because we have customer sat, but then we have things like customer effort scoring, which is a predictive indicator. How hard is it to engage with your services? Things like that. We have, net promoter scores, things like that, that are much. It's a more, it's an area that there's been clear growth and investment. I think employee experience is learning from that, and they're thinking like, okay, employee sat is a delayed indicator, right? It's very, very delayed before we find out about things. But employee effort scoring, and the concept around it could be a predictive indicator, right? How hard is it for employees to do the things they need to do, to engage in the services they need to internally? Those are things that we could use to potentially improve the employee experience. And so this particular organization had the forthright knowledge to say this is going to be a problem. So they actually created a new C-level group, like not HR, not IT, totally new group, and called it the making it. They literally use this term. They're making it easier. That's their name. They're making it easier group. And so they're all about employee effort, right? And essentially making everything easier. And sometimes that's physical stuff, right? Like I guess this kind of spoils a bit of what the company is, but like labs and lab settings and things like that. And sometimes they'll do things like making it easier with digital, right? Like digital experiences and things like that. But when they have this emphasis point, they have stakeholder representation from HR. They have stakeholder representation from IT. They have stakeholder representation from all throughout the business. But I think what makes them so successful is that those like C-level report items around employee effort, they're visible across all those business groups. And they actually found ways to kind of track, departmental, right, employee effort scoring and things like that, which actually further enables, greater funding and other models, which has been really helpful for them. Now, that's a really lucky environment where the organizational leadership from the top down really sees this, right, and says this is something we need to invest in. But I agree. Like I've seen a lot of organizations where the right people in HR and IT and maybe corporate comms and a few groups get together and say, let's just do this, right? Let's just move this dial forward and start to improve employee experience, because we can't do it all alone, and we need to be more supportive and collaborative in this way. I think that's a great example of something else that can hold the future back, is maybe the wrong focus, or doing it in isolation certainly can be a challenge there. Well, let me summarize that. But if you have any other comments, feel free to chime in. I think there's lots of ways we could answer this question. We've given a couple, but gaps in the employee experience sometimes aren't met by vendors, and we haven't really talked about that. So, sometimes what we want, that magical unicorn doesn't exist, right? Like that would make this a lot easier. There's real friction in these tools sometimes. Working collaboratively, you mentioned like I'm in a Teams meeting. And it's not metaverse, right? It's not immersive, right? Maybe the metaverse will make that better, and maybe create its own set of problems that we'll have to work through. But I think that's definitely an area of interest.